Open the very first page of Meditations, the private notebook Marcus Aurelius kept for himself and never intended anyone else to read, and you will not find philosophy. You will not find reflections on virtue or death or the discipline of an emperor's daily duties. You will find something considerably more specific and, on first encounter, almost surprising. A long, careful list of people, his grandfather, his mother, his tutors, his adoptive father, and beside each name in real detail, exactly what that person taught him or gave him. This was not a performance. No one but Marcus was ever meant to read it, which makes the choice worth sitting with directly. Of everything a Roman emperor might have chosen to write first, in the private notebook meant to steady his own mind, he chose gratitude, named with real specificity as his actual starting point. This detail carries particular weight, given who was writing it. Marcus had every reason by the standards of his own culture to begin instead with his achievements, his authority, or his philosophy of rule. Emperors were not generally expected to open their private reflections with a list of debts owed to a grandfather and a tutor. That he did so anyway, purely for his own benefit and with no audience to impress, suggests he had discovered something genuinely useful in the practice, not a gesture of humility performed for others, but a private tool he trusted enough to reach for first. Tonight, in a shorter chapter than usual, we look closely at why and at what a deliberate practice of gratitude, done the way Marcus and Seneca actually understood it, can offer a life today. This is on gratitude. Chapter 1. Why gratitude comes first. There is a reason Marcus placed this list at the very beginning of his notebook, rather than burying it somewhere in the middle after the more obviously philosophical material. Gratitude, understood the way he practiced it, is not a pleasant afterthought tacked onto a serious life. It is the foundation the rest of that life gets built on, an accurate accounting of what you are actually given before any discussion of what you owe the world in return, or what virtue requires of you going forward. Consider what this ordering accomplishes. A person who begins by cataloguing debts, obligations, and unmet ambitions arrives at self-examination already in a posture of lack, measuring a life by what is missing. A person who begins, as Marcus did, by cataloguing what was actually received arrives at the same self-examination from an entirely different posture, one of sufficiency, even abundance, before any harder work begins. This is not naive positivity. Marcus's own list includes real struggle and real limitation elsewhere in his notebook, but he chose deliberately to establish the ground he was standing on before examining anything else. There is a further structural reason this ordering matters. A mind that begins from scarcity tends to approach every subsequent question. What should I do? What do I owe? What have I failed to accomplish? From a defensive, anxious posture, since the starting assumption is already one of insufficiency. A mind that begins from an honest accounting of what has been received approaches those same questions from a steadier place, not because the questions become easier, but because the person asking them is no longer starting from a position of felt deficit. Marcus's entire notebook, read in this light, was built on a foundation laid deliberately in its very first pages. There is a specific, practical implication here worth testing in your own life. Notice which direction your own private reflection typically runs toward what is lacking, unresolved, or still owed, or toward what has already genuinely been given. Neither direction is dishonest, both contain real information. But Marcus's specific choice to begin with the second suggests something worth taking seriously, that gratitude, placed first, changes the entire tone of what follows it, in a way that starting anywhere else does not. To two, gratitude is not a feeling, it's a practice. It is worth being precise about what Marcus and Seneca actually meant by gratitude, because it differs from the warm, spontaneous feeling the word usually calls to mind today. For the Stoics, gratitude was closer to a discipline, something practiced deliberately, on a schedule, whether or not the feeling happened to be present that day, in exactly the same way this series has already described discipline more broadly. Seneca, writing at length on the ethics of giving and receiving in his essay on benefits, treats gratitude as an active judgment rather than a passive mood, a considered recognition that something of genuine value was given, followed by a deliberate choice to acknowledge it. This distinction matters because feelings, as earlier chapters in this series have already established, are notoriously unreliable, dependent on sleep, mood, and the ordinary tide of a difficult week. A gratitude that only shows up when the feeling happens to cooperate is not, in the Stoic account, gratitude at all. It is simply a mood, arriving and departing on its own schedule. This reframing matters practically because it removes gratitude from the same unreliable category as motivation, which an earlier chapter in this series already examined at length. Just as discipline does not wait for motivation to arrive before acting, this Stoic account of gratitude does not wait for the warm feeling to arrive before practicing it. The practice comes first, deliberately performed regardless of mood, and the feeling, when it does arrive, is welcomed as a pleasant addition rather than treated as a prerequisite the practice cannot proceed without. The practical implication is direct. Gratitude, treated as a practice rather than a feeling, can be exercised on the exact days it feels least available, which are, not coincidentally, often the days it is most needed. Marcus did not wait for a particularly good mood before reviewing his list. He returned to it as a deliberate habit, the same way this series has already described the daily practices that build discipline, courage, and an inner citadel. Gratitude belongs on that same list of practiced, repeated disciplines, not on the separate, unreliable list of pleasant feelings that show up only when they choose to. Chapter 3: The Debt That Doesn't Diminish You. There is a specific resistance many people feel toward genuine gratitude, worth naming honestly. A fear that acknowledging what someone gave you makes you smaller, indebted, or somehow lesser than the person who gave it. Seneca addresses this resistance directly, and his answer deserves real attention. He argues that receiving a genuine gift graciously and acknowledging it plainly does not diminish the receiver at all. It is, properly understood, itself a kind of virtue, requiring its own honesty and humility to perform well. The person who cannot acknowledge what they were given out of pride or discomfort with the implied debt is not protecting their independence. They are simply refusing an accurate accounting of their own life, substituting a more flattering but less true story in which everything they have was purely self-made. Seneca goes further still, suggesting that gracious receiving is, in its own way, as much a gift back to the giver as any return favor might be. A person who gives something genuine and watches it be acknowledged plainly, rather than deflected or minimized, receives real confirmation that the gift actually landed and mattered. Refusing to acknowledge a gift out of misplaced pride does not only shortchange your own honest accounting, it quietly withholds something from the giver as well, who is left uncertain whether what they offered was ever genuinely received. This has a specific relevance worth naming for anyone who has built real, hard-won independence across a long life. Precisely the audience most likely to feel this particular resistance most strongly. Acknowledging a teacher's influence, a parent's sacrifice, a friend's timely help does not erase or diminish everything you built through your own genuine effort. It simply completes the picture, honestly. Seneca's argument suggests that the strongest, most secure people are, if anything, the ones most able to acknowledge this debt plainly, precisely because their sense of worth was never actually threatened by it in the first place. Chapter 4. Naming it specifically. Return to Marcus's actual list and notice what makes it work. It is never vague. He does not simply write, "I am grateful for my family." He writes of his grandfather that he learned good character and the government of his temper, of his mother that he learned piety, generosity, and simplicity of living. Each entry names a specific person and a specific gift, rather than a general, diffuse sense of thankfulness. This specificity is not incidental to the practice, it is what makes the practice actually work. A vague gratitude, examined honestly, produces very little real change in how a day is experienced. It remains an abstract, easily forgotten sentiment. A specific gratitude, this exact person, this exact trait, this exact moment it was given, creates something considerably more durable. An actual memory, attached to an actual person, that can be returned to and drawn on precisely because it was never left vague enough to dissolve. There is a useful parallel worth drawing here to the earlier chapter on courage's requirement of naming a fear precisely before it can actually be addressed. Vague fear, left unnamed, governs behavior more powerfully than a fear that has been examined and specified. Vague gratitude behaves the same way in reverse. Left general, it does very little work. Named specifically, it becomes something the mind can actually hold on to, return to, and draw genuine steadiness from during a difficult week. There is a specific exercise worth trying directly from this chapter. Rather than a general feeling of thankfulness for your life, name one person, plainly, and one specific thing they gave you, a lesson, a piece of encouragement at the right moment, a pattern of behavior you quietly absorbed from watching them. Notice how much more substantial this feels than the vaguer version. Marcus discovered this 2,000 years ago in a private notebook meant for no one else. The specificity was never decorative. It was the entire mechanism. Chapter 5. Gratitude for the difficult teachers. One of the more striking features of Marcus's list is who else appears on it beside the obviously loving figures, people who frustrated him, corrected him sharply, or made real demands of him that were not, at the time, comfortable to receive. He includes gratitude for a tutor who taught him to endure hard work and for the specific experience of being corrected without resentment. This extension matters because it prevents gratitude from becoming a selective, comfortable exercise limited only to people who were unambiguously kind. Seneca makes a related point. Some of the most valuable things a person receives across a life arrive wrapped in difficulty rather than comfort. A harsh but accurate piece of feedback, a relationship that demanded real growth, a hardship that built a capacity no comfortable circumstance would have required. This does not require pretending the difficulty itself was pleasant or excusing genuine mistreatment by relabeling it as a hidden gift. That distortion would betray the honesty this entire practice depends on. It asks something narrower, alongside an honest reckoning with what was actually difficult, also looking honestly for whatever specific capacity or lesson genuinely emerged from it. Both can be true of the same relationship at once, without either one cancelling out the other. This is worth applying directly to your own difficult relationships, past or present. Without minimizing genuine harm, which deserves its own honest reckoning rather than forced gratitude, consider whether any specific capacity you now rely on was actually built through a relationship or a season that was not, at the time, comfortable to be inside. Marcus's practice suggests that gratitude, honestly extended even to difficult teachers, is not the same as pretending the difficulty was pleasant. It is simply an honest accounting of what was, despite the difficulty, actually gained. Chapter 6. The Danger of Comparison. Gratitude has a natural enemy, and it deserves direct naming: comparison. The moment attention shifts from what you actually have toward what someone else appears to have more of, gratitude becomes considerably harder to access, regardless of how genuinely full your own life actually is. This connects directly to earlier chapters in this series examining attention and the specific modern hazard of constant, curated comparison. A mind occupied with measuring its own life against a continuous stream of other people's highlight reels has very little spare capacity left for the specific, deliberate practice of naming what it has actually been given. The two postures, grateful attention and comparative attention, are not easily held at once. One tends to crowd out the other. This has a specific relevance worth naming for anyone who came of age before this particular hazard existed in its current, constant form. The comparison Seneca and Marcus warned against in their own era arrived occasionally: a neighbour's larger house, a rival's greater honours, noticed and then set back down. The modern version arrives continuously, deliberately engineered to keep attention returning to it. This makes the deliberate return to specific gratitude not merely a nice practice, but an active, necessary correction against a genuinely stronger undertow than either philosopher had to contend with directly. The practical corrective here is not to eliminate all awareness of other people's lives, which is neither possible nor necessary. It is to notice deliberately when comparison has quietly displaced gratitude as the mind's default posture, and to return on purpose to Marcus's specific practice, not a general accounting of how your life measures up, but a specific naming of what has actually genuinely been given to you, regardless of what anyone else appears to have. Comparison and gratitude are measuring different things entirely, and only one of them was ever likely to leave you more settled at the end of the exercise. Chapter 7. Gratitude toward what you still have. There is a specific application of this practice worth naming directly for anyone currently navigating loss, aging, or diminished capacity. Territory this series has already spent real time examining honestly. Gratitude in these seasons can feel almost impossible to access, understandably overshadowed by grief for what has changed or been taken. Seneca's letters to grieving friends offer a useful, honest middle path here. Not the demand that grief be replaced by forced gratitude, which would dishonor a genuine loss, but the gentle observation that most losses examined honestly leave something behind alongside what was taken. A friend who has died leaves behind the actual years of friendship, which remain real and were genuinely received, regardless of the loss that followed them. A capacity diminished by age leaves behind decades in which that capacity was actually available and used. There is a specific version of this worth naming for the audience this series has consistently addressed. A body that no longer moves as it once did, nonetheless carried you through decades of walks, embraces, and ordinary days that were fully lived while that capacity was available. The gratitude here is not for the current limitation which deserves its own honest grief. It is for the fact that the earlier capacity was genuinely used and genuinely enjoyed, rather than taken for granted or left unspent while it was still fully present. This is not a technique for skipping past grief, which this series has already treated with the seriousness it deserves. It is a companion practice, available alongside grief, rather than instead of it, naming specifically what remains. A relationship still present, a capacity still available, an ordinary pleasure still accessible today, without requiring this naming to erase or minimize whatever has genuinely been lost. Both can be held honestly, at once, exactly as earlier chapters in this series have already described. Chapter 8, The Discipline of Saying It Aloud. There is a meaningful difference worth naming between private gratitude held quietly in your own reflection and gratitude actually spoken to the person who earned it. Marcus's list was private, written for no audience but himself, and this chapter does not argue that private reflection is without value. But Seneca and this series' earlier chapter on courage both suggest something further is available once gratitude moves from private thought into an actual spoken word. This requires a specific kind of courage worth naming directly, the willingness to say plainly and without the safety of vagueness what someone has meant to you, risking the small vulnerability of the moment for the considerably larger value of having actually said it while there was still time. Many people carry private gratitude towards specific people for years, even decades, without ever finding the moment to speak it aloud, assuming a more natural occasion will eventually present itself. This assumption deserves direct challenge in the same spirit an earlier chapter in this series challenged the thief called later. The natural occasion very often does not arrive on its own. It has to be created deliberately by someone willing to interrupt an ordinary conversation with an unscheduled, slightly vulnerable sentence that was never technically required by the moment. The people most worth thanking this way are rarely waiting for a perfect, natural opening. They are simply living their ordinary days, entirely unaware that this particular gratitude exists until someone finally decides to say it. The practical instruction here is direct and matches what earlier chapters have already recommended. Choose one person from your own version of Marcus's list and say the specific thing plainly this week, rather than waiting for an occasion that may not arrive on its own. Private gratitude is valuable. Spoken gratitude, delivered while it can still be received, is considerably more so. Chapter 9, Gratitude as Armor. There is a specific, practical benefit to this practice worth naming in relation to two emotions this series has already examined at length: anger and anxiety. A mind actively engaged in naming what it has been given is, in that same moment, considerably less available to the distorted judgments anger requires or the restless, comparison-driven unease anxiety feeds on. This is not a claim that gratitude eliminates these other states entirely. No single practice accomplishes that. It is a claim about where attention is actually located at any given moment, and the simple fact that attention, fully occupied with specific gratitude, has less room remaining for the specific judgments anger and anxiety depend on to take hold. A person in the genuine middle of naming what a difficult teacher gave them is, in that same moment, not also rehearsing a grievance or catastrophizing an uncertain outcome. This is worth understanding as substitution rather than suppression, a distinction this series has drawn before in other contexts. Suppression asks you to push a difficult feeling down while it continues operating underneath the surface. Substitution, as practiced here, simply gives attention something else genuinely substantial to occupy itself with, not a denial that anger or anxiety exist, but a deliberate redirection toward materials specific and engaging enough to actually hold attention's interest away from them, at least for the duration of the practice. This offers a specific, practical tool worth carrying forward from tonight's chapter. In a moment when anger or anxiety has begun its familiar climb, the delay this series has already recommended can be filled deliberately with exactly this practice, naming one specific person and one specific thing they gave you. This will not resolve every provocation on its own, but it interrupts the momentum considerably more effectively than an empty pause alone, precisely because it gives the mind something substantial to actually do instead. Chapter 10. A Practice for Tonight. Having examined why gratitude came first for Marcus, why it functions as a discipline rather than a feeling, and how it displaces comparison, anger, and anxiety, the practical question becomes how to actually begin, tonight, specifically, rather than as some abstract future intention. The practice itself is simple enough to start immediately. Before closing this video or before sleep tonight, name 3 specific people. The way Marcus did, not a general feeling of thankfulness, but an actual name and an actual specific thing they gave you. Include, if you are willing, at least one person who was not entirely easy to receive it from. Write it down, if that helps make it concrete, the way Marcus's own notebook made his concrete, rather than leaving it to memory alone. There is no wrong way to begin this, and no minimum standard of eloquence required. Marcus's own entries were brief, plain sentences, not polished literary tributes. A single honest line naming a person and what they gave you accomplishes everything this practice is actually for. The value was never in the sophistication of the writing. It was in the specific, deliberate act of naming which any person at any age, with any amount of writing experience, can genuinely do tonight. This need not become an elaborate daily ritual to be valuable. Even attempted occasionally with real specificity, it offers considerably more than a vague, general sense of thankfulness ever could. Marcus returned to his list because it worked, not because tradition demanded it. The same test applies to you tonight. Try it honestly, once, and notice whether the specific naming does something a general feeling of gratitude never quite manages on its own. Conclusion. Marcus Aurelius, ruling an empire in genuine crisis, chose to begin his most private reflections not with ambition or philosophy, but with a careful, specific list of what he had actually been given. This was not sentimentality from a man who had no harder subjects to address. The rest of his notebook proves he had plenty. It was a deliberate choice about where to start, made by someone who understood that an accurate accounting of what you have received changes the entire posture from which everything else gets examined. This connects directly to nearly everything this series has already built. The discipline to practice this regardless of mood, the courage to say it aloud rather than only holding it privately. The citadel's steadiness, drawn on when comparison or anxiety threatens to displace it. Gratitude was never a separate, softer chapter set apart from the rest of this series. It belongs alongside everything else, perhaps, as Marcus suggests, by where he placed it, right at the very beginning. There is a specific reason it made sense to place this shorter chapter here, following directly after old age and friendship rather than earlier in the series. Gratitude, examined honestly, requires something to actually look back on. Relationships, lessons, years genuinely lived, and this series has spent 14 prior chapters helping to build exactly that material. Tonight's practice was never going to work as well at the very start of this journey as it does now, with an actual accumulated life examined honestly across many chapters to draw specific gratitude from. So, take tonight's practice directly into the evening ahead. 3 names, 3 specific gifts, at least one of them difficult to have received. Thank you for spending this shorter chapter with us. We will meet again, same time, for the next chapter in this journey. Until then, name it specifically. That was always the entire practice. End of script. Approximately 30 minutes.